Now, let's take a look at what Sustainable Development Goals mean for us in regard to climate change. And Sustainable Development Goal number 13 states, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Climate change is now affecting every country on every continent. It is disrupting national economies and affecting lives, costing people, communities and countries dearly today and even more tomorrow if we do not do something about it. People are experiencing the significant impacts of climate change, which include changing weather patterns, rising sea level and more extreme weather events. The greenhouse gas emissions from human activities are driving climate change and continue to rise. They are now at their highest levels in history. Without action, the world's average surface temperature is projected to rise to over the 21st century and is likely to surpass 3 degrees Celsius this century, with some areas of the world expected to warm even more. The poorest and most vulnerable people are being affected the most. Affordable, scalable solutions are now available to enable countries leapfrog to cleaner, more resilient economies. Now, the pace of change is quickening as more people are turning to renewable energy and a range of other measures that will reduce emissions and increase adaptation efforts. But can we do more to reverse the effects of climate change to enable our economies progress? And just how can emerging economies leverage on climate change to grow our economies? Joining us now to help us understand more about climate change and emerging economies is Richard Munang, who is the coordinator for UNEP Africa Climate Change. Thank you so much for joining us, Richard. A lot is happening in the world today in regard to sustainable development goals, but more even when it comes to climate change. And we might not exactly see it today, but we cannot deny the effects of climate change today. Would you say that African economies are doing something about it?
I think actually, despite the fact that Africa have contributed very little to the emissions that are causing climate change in the world,
right,
Africa is actually providing solutions. For example, before the Conference of Parties last year, December, in Paris, Africa went there not just to complain, but actually to provide solutions. And one of the solutions which they provided was they came up with 2 initiatives. One on how to harness the untapped renewable energy which the continent today harbors in quite an abundance, and at the same time also a program on an Africa Adaptation Initiative. So Africa is providing solutions on this front.
Okay. And, you know, with the passage of the Paris Agreement, just like you mentioned, there's been quite some bit of optimism that has been seen on the African continent. But how do we even leverage on this in regard to taking action?
The Paris Agreement, for the first time, actually provides an opportunity for each and every country, as compared to what was agreed in 1992 called the Kyoto Protocol, which was only applicable for developed countries. But this time around, the Paris Agreement provides a level playing field for countries in developing continents or in the developing world to be able to tap into opportunities. And one of these opportunities is, how can you be able to develop in such a way that you are not adding emissions, but at the same time tapping into the opportunities that exist? For example, the Paris Agreement comes with what is called the intended national determined contributions, and these are actually country plans which were submitted before the Conference of Parties last year, 2015 December.
Right.
And Africa actually submitted these plans, and within these plans, 60% of these plans are actually land-based, which means that they are focused on agricultural activities done in such a way that the emissions which are supposed to be actually harbored under the ground are not emitted to add to the greenhouse gases. And part of this is also focused on energy, but energy from clean sources like solar, like wind, like hydro, which the continent today is only using 10% of the over 1,000 terawatts that exist. So Africa could tap into this Paris Agreement and create jobs, especially in catalytic sectors like agriculture, which today employs 65% of the entire workforce in the continent. But at the same time, it could also tap in the energy sector, which I have mentioned, and ensuring that the activities which could actually be used to enhance agricultural production are working with nature and not against nature. That is ensuring that the environment is intact. What is called ecosystems, our rivers, our forests, our soils managed in such a way that you are not emitting carbon into the atmosphere, but at the same time enhancing yields. And linking these across the entire agro-value chain by utilizing clean energy like solar, like wind, could create jobs up to about 17 million, as studies have shown. And the World Bank report projected that the agro-economy in 15 years could be worth $1 trillion US.
All right. So it all seems, beautiful to listen to. But then again, when it comes to taking action, we don't seem to be taking the right action. And maybe one would say this is tied to the fact that we lack the resources to enable us even take the necessary action. So how exactly do we finance climate action?
Actually, resources are actually the elephant in the room. In 2015, the UN Environment Programme, in collaboration with partners, released a report called the Second Africa Adaptation Gap Report, which shows that if the world was to hit 2 degrees, which probability is quite very high that it could hit 2 degrees, the African continent will need up to $50 billion US a year between now and 2050. But if the world was to hit 4 degrees, the continent will need $100 billion US to be able to build resilient systems and actually adapt to the changing climate. But the report also shows that if Africa was to look internally, which is actually something which the Paris Agreement presented, that in as much as developed countries are supposed to support with financial support, in developing countries could also voluntarily look internally to be able to generate revenue to build their climate resilience. However, it is quite very important to say that the capitalization of what is called the Green Climate Fund, currently above 11 billion today, may not be able to address all the challenges that the continent of Africa is facing vis-a-vis the skyrocketing amounts that I've mentioned, ranging 50 billion if the world was to remain below a 2 degree and 100 billion USD if the world was to reach 4 degrees. So it's therefore paramount for the continent to look internally, and there are actually areas where the continent could look internally in addition to leveraging international financial support. And one of these is, if you look at the entire agro-value chain today, the continent is losing $48 billion US as a result of inefficiencies in the agro-value chain, whether it is as a result of post-harvest loss because there is lack of adding value to the agricultural products, or it is as a result of transportation to market, which then could be an area that could actually be looked into to be able to reverse these $48 billion US. But the worst of all is the continent is spending $35 billion US every year importing food. And if the continent was to utilize these approaches which I mentioned, working with nature, not against nature, they could be able to reverse this. And the continent is also losing $68 billion US as a result of land degradation every year. So if they were actually able to utilize practical approaches which have been proven to work, working with nature and protecting ecosystems, they could then reverse this amount of money that they're losing and actually inject this into climate resilient activities in the continent.
Right. So what we're seeing on the African continent is extreme weather patterns. Temperatures are too high, which maybe many a time causes drought, and maybe we have heavy floods in parts of Kenya as well as other parts of the continent. So how exactly do we tap into the younger generation? We have about 75% of our population on the African continent being the youthful population. So how do we tap into that generation to ensure that we are securing the future of our continent?
This is an excellent question. We are talking at a time when the population of the African continent is just a little bit above 1.1 billion as we speak today. And in less than 35 years, this will hit 2.4 billion. But as you said, the youthful population is just above 200 million and projected to reach 400 million in less than 20 years from today. At the same time, you have 60% of this youthful population unemployed. And the question should then be, how do we create the jobs, as we rightly put? But it is, these jobs are going to come in areas that are highly catalytic. And these sectors that are highly catalytic are the agricultural sector and also the energy sector. So still, if you dovetail these within Agenda 2063 of the African Union and the Sustainable Development Goals, there is an opportunity to leverage these global continental blueprints, global from Sustainable Development Goals to the Paris Agreement, then the continental, the Agenda 2063, which provide the framework to be able to utilize what these catalytic sectors actually have to do in terms of creating jobs. And the UN Environment Programme, in collaboration with partners, came up with what is called the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation for Food Security Assembly.
Yeah.
And the ultimate premise of this is, how do you bring everyone together to be able to address cross-cutting issues like climate change, like food security, like addressing poverty, and ensuring that you're moving away from conferences but domesticating ideas right at the national level, and bringing those who have ideas from the private sector, bringing those from policy making, bringing those from civil societies, from NGOs, and bringing youth to be able to use their talent to address climate change and actually also create jobs.
Right.
And this is actually being rolled out across the entire continent today. And as I speak today, there are 35 countries that have set up these national branches, and Kenya is actually one of them. And the ultimate end goal is to be able to address the job unemployment challenges we're facing today. We cannot look beyond the already opportunities that are already existing, but it will be good to look at these catalytic sectors, the agricultural sector,
So
as
we
well
can
as the
leverage on
renewable
that.
energy, to transition towards a low emissions development pathway, and at the same time ensure that structural transformation can be able to happen.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Richard Munang. He is the Regional Climate Change Coordinator at the Regional Office for Africa, that is UNEP, or United Nations Environment Programme. Thank you so much for sharing your views.